Hi, everyone, and welcome back to that UFO podcast. My name is Andy, and very quick reminder and shameless plug to everyone that for the month of April, if you click the link in the bio and description, you can sign up to the Patreon for free and get access to episodes early, in full, with no adverts and bonus content as well. A little thank you as the podcast runs into its 5th year or 5-year anniversary. Yeah, 5-year
Mhm.
anniversary in early May 2025. So please check that one out, sign up, or you can just pay for a YouTube subscription, whatever you want to do. But thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. And big thank you to Nathan joining us, co host of Liminal Frames, and of course, calling all beings over there in the cab. How are things, Nathan?
Great, Andy. Things are going well. It's been a busy time for me this year so far, but enjoying the weather that we're getting now. It's starting to get a little bit nicer outside, although I have severe allergies, so I'm also struggling with that just a little bit. But it's great to see some greenery return to our landscape here because we had such a rough 6 months. Of course, following that hurricane in Asheville, it's
Yeah,
been
you
a
got
rough
it bad,
time.
didn't you? Like you and the
Very
family.
bad. Very bad. So, but things are looking up, and I think the community is really excited to see that seasonal change, and beyond that, just excited to to kind of talk about the UFO space. There's stuff going on. I know some people may think that it feels like a little bit of a downtime, but I think there's a lot happening behind the scenes, and we're going to get more information on that pretty soon. But it's also a good time to kind of reflect on how far we've
Mm,
come in this conversation.
yeah, absolutely. 2001, I was 15. May 2001, Nathan. I was 15 years old. Wrestling and football were my life back then. What about yourself? What were you up to?
Yeah, it's wild. So I was about to get married in May of 2000. I got married at the end of May of 2001. So this will be 24 years for us this year. Um, and that was a wild year. A lot happened in that year, of course, as you
Mm,
know. So it was an interesting year for us, just kind of starting off on our newly married journey. And I feel like I may have caught some of this. We're going to talk about it. I feel like I caught some of this conference at the time, or that the National Press Club event at the time, but I didn't have nearly the interest in UFOs that I do now. So it's interesting to kind of look back at that footage and kind of go, wow, what was society like, and where was this topic like then?
yeah, this is one where I think a lot of folks who, if you're well versed and well entrenched in the UFO topic, you may know about this event, the National Press Club in Washington, May 2001. Others newer to the topic may not know about it. Even if you're not big on social media, you may never have seen the clips floating about. But 2001, a very different time. You've got the early days of the internet as it was for commercial use.
Mhm.
The internet had been around for quite a while before then, but rest in peace, AOL, because many, many days were wasted for me back in my youth on AOL chat rooms
Oh yeah.
and browsing the net. For me, it was like wrestling, football, movie news, stuff like that back in the day. The UFO topic, while I'd had my sightings when I was younger, weren't front and foremost in my mind. We're miles away still from social media
Mhm.
blowing up and becoming the thing that it would become. So stuff could go under the radar, but this was a big event. So I want to give you a little background though, folks. Steven Greer, I think, is a much maligned and divisive name, Nathan, in the UFO topic in 2025. However, for people who may not know his background or be less aware of him, let's look at who Steven Greer is, who put on this event. He was a practicing ER, emergency room physician, and trauma specialist, so he is a legit doctor. He is not one of these guys who sticks a prefix on the front of his name, like I'm joined by Lieutenant Nathan. But you have no army expertise or background.
You have to call
You
me
get
that
loads,
from now on.
yeah,
Right.
you get that so often, don't you? Like, but he's a legitimate doctor. He was a serious doctor. He must have been making good money. Like,
Yeah.
that's a good career back in 2001. He served as chairman of emergency medicine at Caldwell Memorial Hospital in North Carolina. But by 2001, he left his medical practice to dedicate himself full time to UFO research and disclosure efforts. That's a hell of a career change.
Yeah. Pretty dramatic. Um,
Legitimacy, though, for you, does that lend anything? Like,
well, it's fascinating because for various reasons. I mean, one, interesting little tidbit of info here. He was a ER doctor in Asheville, believe it or not. And so I did not know that for the longest time. And of course, now I live here. I'm not from here, so it's kind of weird to be in a place where he kind of had a home for a while. And yeah, I think probably to his colleagues, he must have looked like somebody who absolutely lost his mind, right? I mean, this is a person who's clearly very successful, very competent, kind of the height of his career. And when you watch this footage from of him in 2001, he's a very young, a little bit thinner Stephen Greer, but you can tell this is a guy that has a lot of career left ahead of him, and to kind of leave that money behind. And we're talking about many hundreds of thousands of dollars is
Yeah.
what he's walking away from to pursue this is really I don't know. I don't know that anybody else would be willing to do that. It's quite something, and that does bring, I think, a certain degree of legitimacy to his effort for him to have those kinds of credentials and be as well spoken as he is. So it
Mm.
does. You can tell from the passion that he brings to the introduction and all the work that he put into getting those people together and all the other witnesses that he got together, that this guy put a lot of time and energy into it. And it must not have come just from some sort of, monetary desire or desire for fame. This guy had, he had a sighting, he had an experience. He felt compelled to pursue this. And then he also, in that pursuit, I think, was met with a lot of folks who had information, who were willing to talk to him and encourage him to continue to pursue this and push it into the mainstream conversation.
Yeah, if you are an ER doctor, you're on the board, you're the chairman of the emergency medicine at your local facility. If you want to make more money, you don't leave and join the UFO research community, especially long before the days of social media and all that kind of stuff. You pursue the medical career, you pursue that field. So fair play in that respect. In the 1990s, he founded the Disclosure Project, which is aimed at compelling the US government to reveal what it knew about UFOs. So who was Stephen Greer in 2001? Greer had gained attention with the UFO community for organizing briefings for high-level officials, including members of Congress, CIA Director James Woolsey in a meeting in 1993, and senior Pentagon officials. He claimed at this point to have gathered over 400 government, military, and intelligence witnesses who were prepared to testify under oath to their direct knowledge of extraterrestrial encounters and UFO secrecy. And he was regarded by supporters at the time as a serious and credible figure trying to bridge the gap between UFO issues and mainstream political and scientific institutions. There were critics, however, Nathan, who questioned the verifiability of some of the more sensational claims associated with his project. That last part, we'll look round at the end, I don't think is something that has escaped him during his time in the UFO topic. Is that fair?
I think that is fair. And I think you see seeds of that in this press club event in some of his comments. So I think we'll get a chance to talk about that a little bit further. But there have always been elements in his particular narrative that have, I think, maybe for some improved his opinion, but for many others, probably more others than not, that has kind of soured them on Stephen Greer. So yeah, we can get into that for sure, and I think it's important to get into that. But I think as you're hinting at, just generally, I mean, we owe a lot to Stephen Greer, for kind of
Hmm.
carrying the torch here in a time when a lot of people weren't doing that and people weren't taking it very seriously, and the level of organization that he brought to this disclosure project of his really was something that nobody else was doing, at least doing it to that level and with that kind of passion. So, we owe a lot to that effort. And in many ways, we kind of stand on the shoulders of Stephen Greer and the work that he did at that time. Of course, we can debate, where we are now and where he is in the conversation now. But I think we wouldn't be here without the work of Stephen Greer.
No, that it was a time, like you say, of newsletters, magazines, VHS videotapes being passed around of conferences and sightings. I imagine at the time, a lot of folks who maybe saw this not at the time got it from a videotape. It would have been sent to them in the mail. There were websites, but websites, folks, if you are of a certain age, you will remember back then you were on dial-up internet. So when you hear the do 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 do, it, the famous noise. You couldn't use the phone for the most part when you were on the internet; it would cut off, and websites could take an age to load in. So this was all being done still at that time. We had all this new technology coming in, but it was still pretty old school. And I miss that. I miss the physical hard copies. I was signed up to so many different newsletters and clubs, and I was that kid. People won't be surprised, I don't think. Were you like that, Nathan?
I had some, yeah. I had, I was pretty much very into video games, still like video gaming, so I would get some video game magazines on the regular. Probably some email newsletters from time to
Mhm.
time. But like you said, it was a totally different experience. Online was nothing like it looks like now.
Yeah.
The amount of time spent online for me was mainly just chatting with my friends on AOL Instant Messenger. So,
Yeah, yeah, the glory days,
mhm.
folk. But I think it's important to frame the time for what it was. So, Disclosure Project with Steven Greer by 2001 had reached a critical mass. He'd gained a lot of notoriety. He was clearly a man with connections, as we know now. You can't hold that against him. And he announced the event at the National Press Club in Washington D.C. on May 9th, 2001. The event would feature 20 military intelligence, FAA, and corporate witnesses. It was streamed online, receiving hundreds of thousands of views. Web streaming, however, was in its infancy, so I can only imagine the quality of the audio and picture of that back then, and that won't be his fault. There's no excuse for that now being poor. I mean, my kids can stream online in 4K if they choose to. Back then, it was a far, far more difficult thing to kind of set up and stream, wasn't it? We weren't all just hosting podcast and TV channels on our own back then.
Yeah, streaming was not a thing at all. I don't think anybody really thought that there would be people 20 years from then who would be having careers streaming. So,
Yeah,
yeah, quite a different time.
and in a lot of ways, there's a lot of people who shouldn't have ever had careers doing so. But that's
Present
kind of
company excluded, of course. Yes.
yeah, yeah, well, that's debatable. But yeah, if you're watching this, you probably don't mind me. Um, People might hate you, Nathan. I don't know, but no,
I'm sure someone
people.
does.
I imagine if you're still here at this point, you're okay with it. Um, Greer framed the UFO secrecy issue just before we get into the actual opening statements. Not just in terms of extraterrestrial contract, but he did use national security and moral issues as a concern. Not necessarily national security, that these ET or beings were malevolent or dangerous, but that the secrecy, the gatekeepers, that the humanity was causing the national security issue or elements of it, which is interesting. But he did use that back in the day, and it was all about suppression of world-changing technologies, suppression of clean energy. Um, a lot that you can look at and go, fair enough. Like it's a lot of the claims. Again, we'll get to the muddying of that message over time is perhaps what rubbed a lot of people up the wrong way. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think it is fair. There are definitely the same themes that you hear today echoed about, excessive government secrecy, sort of shadow government, unelected officials and contractors who are holding these secrets against the knowledge of, without the knowledge of Congress or the president. Even he speaks to that in the conference as well. Presidents that had been, from in his perspective, had been read into this secret, but then subsequent presidents who had not been read into the secret.
Yeah.
So yeah, you get a sense that there is that kind of to a certain degree, a moral imperative for a democracy to have access to this information, and that kind of getting the idea that he feels in some ways affronted on behalf of the average person that we have this incredible knowledge and we're not sharing it with the world.
Yeah, so this totally, pardon the pun, wasn't on my radar back in the day. Not that I remember. Probably came across some links on Yahoo News or something again, just to age the time period, folks. But yeah, not for me. So you can watch the full thing online as well. I'll put the link in the description. It's readily available on YouTube. Um, Greer started up, Nathan, with the opening statement saying, "The reason we are coming forward now is that we are asking for the US Congress and President Bush to move towards an official inquiry and disclosure on this subject. It has the most profound implications for the human future, for US national security and world peace. Specifically, technologies connected to UFOs and extraterrestrial vehicles, if declassified and used for peaceful energy generation and propulsion, would solve the looming energy crisis definitively. It would end global warming and it would correct the environmental challenges the Earth is facing." To paraphrase the rest of it, Nathan, he then goes on to say, Placing weapons in space should not happen. We are sharing space with other civilizations, and this is being kept off the people's radar. He mentions national security as a threat, but from the keepers of the secrets, and that ET are concerned about our hostility. He called for open, honest congressional hearings, wanted to use the tech for clean energy and get humanity off of fossil fuels. He also asked, please be skeptical, but that is not the same as being closed minded and prejudiced. That is a message I feel he lost in how he presents himself here
Hmm.
and how he presents himself in 2025. So, what was your thoughts on Greer opening statement and how he comes across?
Yeah, I think you can tell from his tone, from the message that he's giving there in that opening statement, from the caliber of the witnesses that he had assembled, both in person and in that, I think he said, over 500-page briefing document, the 400 other witnesses or whatnot. Is it 400 or 40 others? It was a lot.
400
Yeah,
other witnesses, yeah.
400 other witnesses. Yeah, it was a lot. So
Couldn't
you
fit
can
them all in
tell,
the room.
yeah, you can't fit them all. So you can tell from that tone that this is a man who is full of conviction in what he's doing. So he's got enough information, and he's heard from enough, in his mind, credible people that he is, you know, a man on fire. He's very committed to this cause. He believes that just when people have a chance to hear the testimony, hear the information, that they will be convinced. He just wants people to have the opportunity to hear it, which is sort of why he's pushing and why he had all of these panelists, from the folks who stood up to talk. He had all of them conclude their talk with, "I'm willing to testify before Congress." So
Mm,
that was the sort of the landing place. If we can just get in front of Congress, we can just get this information out to the American people, to the world, the evidence will be overwhelming, convincing, and we'll finally be able to move this forward. And I think he legitimately thought that he was on the cusp of that kind of breakthrough. So it's interesting looking back, now 24 years later, and kind of seeing, well, how far have we come? And then also looking at Stephen Greer today, and kind of understanding, or trying to understand, maybe the journey that he's gone through
yep.
in those many years, from thinking like this was imminently happening to then obviously not happening. And then, now he's doing what he's doing, still trying to push for it, but certainly not with the same degree of, I think, credibility that he once had.
Yeah. I've got a list of all the folks who appear. So essentially, folks, what happens is Stephen Greer says his opening bit, he sits down, and then it's pretty rapid fire. It's almost like the early days of social media, but in person, where each individual witness stands up, says who they are, and they have an amount of time, sometimes less than a minute, other times a couple of minutes, and they basically say their piece. And like you say, Nathan, quite rightly, they state at the end, I am willing to testify that this is the truth as I know it in front of Congress, and they get a round of applause. And that's how the session goes right the way through till Greer's closing kind of statement and remarks and Q&A. Well, we start reeling off. I've got a list of all the witnesses, and I'll go through, Nathan, who they are, what their job was, if it was relevant. Most of them are. And then I've got a little blurb on each one, and we can pass them over or talk about them, just depending on it and what your notes are as well, mate, if you want.
Sounds great.
So first witness was Mr. John Callahan, retired FAA Head of Accidents and Investigations. That's the Federal Aviation Authority, folks. He talked about an event where over Alaska in November 1986, a cargo plane encountered a UFO that was around 4 times larger than the plane. It was picked up on radar, seen for around half an hour too. John Callahan says he briefed CIA, FBI, President Reagan's scientific team also. They were told to keep this confidential. The event never happened. He himself was surprised at that because he wasn't thinking aliens, UFO necessarily back in the day. He thought it was a stealth bomber or something that they were seeing or being picked up, but he was told, no, it's a UFO. This would panic the public. Shut up about it. Decent opening witness, interesting statement.
I thought so. I thought a strong opening, and he had evidence with him. He was, "Yeah, I've got this evidence. I'm willing to present it." He seemingly had a good recall of the individuals who were present in the room for that briefing, and he said what a lot of us have heard many people say who've had these kinds of experiences with government debriefings of this kind, and that's, we don't talk about this. The American public isn't going to know this. You might as well forget this ever happened, and let's go on about our way. So Yeah, I think a pretty compelling start to that panel, and um, at first I thought he was talking about kind of the Japanese incident, the Japanese commercial plane that flew,
Hmm.
but I know that this is a totally separate incident, but a similarly large craft off the coast of Alaska. So yeah, really interesting opening there, and that I think it gets better from there. To be honest, there's a lot of good stuff on this panel.
There is, yeah, and there's some interesting detail as well. One thing, not to skip ahead too far, that gets thrown at this event back in the day from the media afterwards is it's a lot of testimony, a lot of interesting testimony, but really lacks in strong first-hand evidence because you've got and this will reflect back on maybe where we are now in 2025 and some folks' frustrations. There are a range of folks here who either experienced what they experienced or were involved in it themselves. And then there are others who say, I spoke to, and we'll get to it, X, and they told me this. And you're like, right, okay, well, there's different levels to how much weight some of this stuff holds. And I imagine several of these, maybe if this did get to congressional hearings, which it didn't, folks, at the time, spoiler alert, but by now, won't spoil the end of Titanic, but you know what happens.
Right.
There are folks I don't think Congress would have been interested in, but there are others where they definitely know more, they can talk more, and perhaps can give further evidence that they can't tell the public. Does that sound about right?
Yeah, I think that's right. You kind of have to take it. I take this in sort of the totality. There's a lot of really credentialed people on this panel from different walks of life, many of which have served in the government in some capacity or another, whether that be military or civilian. But these are people who society basically trusts with very important functions
Yeah.
in the government, and they're all kind of giving a similar message. They don't necessarily know each other. They're not, kind of getting their stories straight together behind the scenes before they go and talk about this kind of stuff. And you continue to hear the same type of information over and over again. So it's either everyone's having an incredibly distorted picture of reality, and that raises its own host of questions, or in my mind, there is some real truth here. So it's compelling, like you say, in terms of a firsthand witness account. That is pretty lacking in this group.
Second up, we had Lieutenant Colonel Charles L. Brown, retired US Air Force. Now, Nathan, he talked about analysing data as a pilot investigator for Project Grudge. It was a very quick appearance, this one. Like, I was kind of blinking, you'll miss them. I think I was eating a bowl of cereal while I was watching and taking notes at this point. And literally between picking the bowl up, taking a couple of mouthfuls, putting it down, he was on and gone. Very quick, but he has a storied military background. And basically, this guy is coming on saying, I've seen documentation, I've seen comments about UFOs, recoveries, this stuff's real. I'll testify in front of Congress, and off he goes.
Yeah,
Kind of blinking, you'll miss him, but that was it.
Charlie Brown. He said he likes to be called Charlie Brown. That's what's
He
stuck
does,
with me
yeah.
the most, I think. But yeah, he said he was part of Grudge, the precursor, to, of course, to Project Blue Book. That a lot of the UFO sightings would come across his desk, and he found them to be very credible. He was also a pilot during World War II.
Hmm.
So here's again another person with a solid professional career. Clearly, had been tasked by the military to at least evaluate these kinds of claims, and he found them to be credible. I think that says a lot.
Maybe a good place to point out if this if this happened now, I think we are a little spoiled the last
Mm.
couple of years with witnesses coming forward, with whistleblowers coming forward, with individuals coming out who were involved in the UAP task force and all kinds of stuff. That it would have less of an impact, and this was sort of the first thing of this kind, with this kind of volume, not just one talking head speaking about one incident or thing. These were 20 different people with a lot of different backgrounds, like you say. So bear that in mind, folks, when you hear this, that it was pretty groundbreaking
Right? Yeah,
and
you had
difficult for them as well, I think, Nathan, sorry.
no, it's fine. That you had some folks in decades prior who had similar kinds of credentials, but they were kind of coming forward in a bit of a vacuum. They
Yep.
weren't backed up by many other colleagues from different elements of the government. So, yeah, I found that to be really interesting, and you do kind of think to yourself, well, what? what would the reception be now for someone coming forward with a similar kind of pedigree? And in some ways, we've kind of been we've grown complacent, or we've grown too comfortable with this sort of testimony, because
Sure.
it's kind of ubiquitous. There's a lot of it, and
Mhm.
maybe the fact that there's been so much of it and yet nothing has actually happened, that has resulted in this, I think, byproduct of skepticism. That well, all these people have said stuff, and we've heard it. I've heard it over and over again. The government, blah blah blah. Government's lying to us. Well, I mean, where is the proof? Where are the aliens? Where's the craft? And I think that kind of that combination, it's to go back to kind of the Charlie Brown metaphor, Lucy and the football, right? You kind of feel like
Yeah.
it's there, and it gets continually yanked out, and you feel like we're never be able to kick this through the goalposts. So football here, obviously American football, just to clarify.
Yeah, of course. You have to get that one right. Egg ball. Um,
Football.
Not to be confused with the craft that are being picked up by folks out in various ranges. Third witness was Michael Smith, US Air Force radar controller. He talks about in the 1970s arriving on site one day to see a UFO on radar at 80,000 feet, slowly descending. It disappeared, reappeared back at 80,000 feet, and then traveled 200 miles and stayed stationary. We are 3 years off of the Tic Tac event, but I think that had eerie similarities to Commander Fravor and Alex Dietrich's event, yeah.
I mean, how can you not think about Kevin Day here, right? So
Yeah,
Mike Smith, Kevin Day, almost exact same kind of testimony, 80,000 feet, coming down very slowly, behaving in interesting ways. I mean, this is in some ways the same story, just told from a 20
absolutely.
year gap there.
Potentially the same objects. We
Could
don't
be.
even know all that kind of stuff, like, have these things been around for a while? But yeah, that was pretty interesting for me and kinda stood out. The fourth witness was, Enrique Colbeck. He worked in air traffic control in Mexico City, and he talks about, multiple events. But he talks about one where on March 4th, 1992, there were multiple radar contacts seen, up to 15 objects picked up at once on radar. Talked about a later incident that was almost a collision of a domestic flight and a UFO. So I like that we go from having a few military witnesses here to a guy involved in air traffic control. Not a military guy. You start to see a little bit of variety. Kellogg's Variety Pack breakfast cereal here. A little bit of something for everyone. And I think that gets your attention more than just military, military, military. So yeah, I'd like seeing that from Enrique.
Yeah, I agree, and an international voice as well. And after the panelists spoke, and Greer was taking Q&A, there were it seemed to be members of the press who were from sort of non-U.S. locations. It sounded
The
that way.
first lady that speaks, I think, because is
Yeah,
Mexican. Yeah.
sounded that way. So I think that that's good, and maybe it can be a little bit lost. But I thought it's nice to be able to show this isn't just isolated to the United States; that it's happening in other parts of the world.
Yeah. Fifth witness, it was Graham, was it Bethune? Bethune? Pronouncing that wrong,
Oh
but
yeah,
he
Bethune, right?
Bethune, yeah, Graham Bethune, a retired US Navy. A lot of the folks from this point start mentioning that they have top secret clearances, above. Some are just secret clearances below. But that was interesting to cite. He talks about 1951, he was flying over Iceland, Newfoundland, and he saw, I think it was Newfoundland, saw a glow on the water, a circle of white lights. The lights went out, then a small yellow halo appeared, which from 15 miles away came up almost right next to him. He had to maneuver the aircraft he was flying with around 30 passengers on it, for fear of impact. He could see the object had a dome. He was told not to report it, as the Air Force might not let them fly again. So that stigma was there. And I believe the Air Force psychiatrist was also on the flight and saw this. But everyone on board was very much like, this is a career ender. Let's not talk about it. And the radar also picked up the object, tracking it at around 1,800 miles per hour. So almost a bog standard classic UFO encounter here for the military, but really interesting. And again, it gets across that stigma that's been around since what, the 50s?
Yeah, I did find that story very interesting, and I think he said at one point he even went back and tried to get a perspective from the passenger's perspective, not just being in the flight cabin. Um, and that stigma clearly very strong, right? That he wasn't willing to talk about it, or they felt like they couldn't talk about it for risk of losing their ability to fly. And but the encounter, he seemed to have a little bit more knowledge than he was willing to share or did share in that brief moment. I should put it that way. And just I say that because of the way he described the craft. He seemed to not only describe the appearance, but he used a word, and I can't. It started with a C, and I can't remember what it was, but it was describing the like the
Oh,
coronal
coronal effect or
effect
coronal
of some kind. Yeah.
something. Yep.
Mhm. So he had some. He at least had maybe on his own formulated some notion of how it might be propelling itself,
Mm.
through coronal mass ejection or something like that. There was some effect he described that sounded very technical. Thought that was
Mm.
interesting, and maybe he, had some further knowledge about that, or that was just kind of his own pet theory.
Witness number 6 was Dan Willis, US Navy, top secret clearance. He talks about in 1969, he was as part of a ship. The ship itself was classified as secret in Alaska, and it had reported a bright, glowing red-orange object around 70 feet long, came up out of the water and traveled into space at around 7,000 miles per hour. This was tracked on radar. Do you know what surprised me most about this one, Nathan?
What's that?
Is this is the most watched part of the whole conference on YouTube.
Hmm. Interesting.
I'm presuming at some point this has been linked somewhere on Reddit or something like that,
Mhm.
and that was the clip, because I was really surprised of all the folks on here. That wasn't one that I thought it's a interesting, testimony.
Yeah.
It's pretty short, sharp, and succinct, but
Hmm.
that one is one of the 3 most watched peaks of this whole, it is the most watched, actually. So, yeah, thoughts on Dan
I
Willis?
mean, it's
Not
very
Dan, sorry.
interesting. Yeah, we can talk about Dan later. Very, very interesting account. I think it was the only account, if I recall correctly, that was transmedium in the sense that we would describe it now, coming up out of the ocean, and then
Into air, then into space.
transitioning
Yep,
to
I
space.
think so.
Yeah, the size of the object, the coloration of the object. A really, really interesting account, in my opinion, and that connection to the ocean, of course, very persistent in the UFO lore. So, yeah, fascinating, and again, that hint about there being evidence of this event on radar, that it exists somewhere. Of course, you can think of the number of other personnel who are on that ship that would have also witnessed that event. So, there are a lot of, in other words, if you're an investigator, I think there are a lot of leads to follow with UFOs accounts like this, and it just kind of, for those of us who follow it, I think we get pretty frustrated that these leads have never really been followed in a public sense. So it's
Yes.
interesting.
Yeah, I'm glad you add public, because we don't know that in the background these aren't followed up a lot more. Um, Interesting witness coming up next. So we move away from military, and it's Don Phillips, who was working at Lockheed Skunk Works and also a CIA contractor. He talks about working on designs for the SR-71. He said it had a predecessor craft that was, and I really like this one actually. That was a one pilot craft that was built to travel from A to B really quickly. So, yep, standard, fast traveling aircraft in the military. But he says there was evidence that once in the air, these crafts pilots had been assigned a task, and they would only get the task just before takeoff. And they were monitoring traffic coming into planet Earth from orbit. I thought that was fascinating. He also talked about while living on a base, saw a UFO, lights in the sky moving at incredible speeds with 4 or 5 other people, and the objects would have been close to or over Area 51 as they knew it then. But yeah, what's your take on that one, Nathan? I thought that was pretty interesting.
It really was, and it's kind of surprising in a way that you had this Lockheed engineer being willing to talk about this, and of course we have echoes of this with TTSA. We have echoes of participation in the effort from TTSA, from Lockheed as well. Um, that kind of craft being built just for CIA purposes, like that was also really, really, really interesting. I think he was speculating a little bit about what that mission, that unique mission
Yeah.
might be, but again, it's not speculation from the standpoint of someone who has no knowledge at all. It's informed speculation. So I find that to be really interesting. And the other thing I would want to say that we haven't touched on yet is that the relative age of a lot of these witnesses was pretty fairly older, and a
Yeah.
lot of them probably aren't with us any longer, right? So it's interesting in that respect that we've got all these credentialed voices that many of whom aren't with us anymore, and so it's great that we have that testimony on record. But think of all the secrets that we just aren't going to be able to know because those voices aren't with us any longer.
No, that's a really good point. It made me wonder at this point as well, perhaps because it was CIA, Lockheed Skunk Works, was there any element of it would have been very easy to put plants into these types of things, to share testimony, share stories, just listen to what's happening, being discussed deliberately by folks like the CIA or, shadowy cabal government gatekeepers? Did that cross your mind?
I mean, I think it has to, and you've got to remember in recent times too, with Greer's more recent press club event, you had Jake Barber who said that he was there, sort of evaluating, kind of doing analysis on some of the individuals who are stepping forward to share their testimony. So I'm certain that there would have been similar kinds of individuals at that press club event, gathering intelligence and seeing kind of what was being publicly shared, what maybe shouldn't have been shared. And then, like you say, I wouldn't at all put it past them to be part of that, to be part of that effort in some official capacity. And in some ways, too, you have to wonder, it doesn't necessarily mean that those folks are in on some sort of secret. It just means that they are the kind of person that, given the right suggestions, given the right permissions, will go ahead and just talk about what they know.
Mm.
And so it's not like they were led into this grand master plan, like, hey, this is what we want you to do. We want you to get up and tell everybody about this very specific thing. And we're giving you the green light to do that. It's just kind of finding the right people in these certain roles who, given the right stimulus, would in fact be willing to step forward and talk about some aspect of what they know. And we could also debate whether whatever they think they know is in fact true, right? So there's that other element to it. Is this disinformation or is it accurate?
I am going to make a note to bring in the Jake Barber conversation at the end, because I think that's definitely worth bringing in. Um, Robert Salas comes up next, so I think probably the best known of the witnesses for those of us modern times, because Robert, Mr. Salas, for a bit of respect, I'll give him, is still out there talking about the UFO topic. He famously here talks about the incident at Malmstrom Air Force Base in 1967 on a base that housed nuclear missiles. Strange lights were reported overhead. A large oval shaped object, bright glowing object, was then spotted and reported to Robert. The missiles famously were rendered unlaunchable, deactivated. Around 6 to 8 missiles in that incident were affected. One of the most famous incidents in ufology, he mentions others similar happening elsewhere reported to him. This is something that a lot of people hang their hats on, as these objects can turn off our nukes. So there's an assumed knowledge. They know what they are, they know what they're for, they know what they can do. Is it a message? Is it a demonstration of power? Is it something they are doing that just as a consequence, these things deactivate? That seems less likely. But Malmstrom is a pretty well known case now in UFO lore.
That's right. Yeah, it's good to see Bob Salas still going at it now, and quite frankly, he looks basically the same. The guy's got he's hasn't
I
changed
thought
a
that
whole
when I
lot.
saw him, I was like, wow, that could be now. Yeah.
Like Bob Salas is a time traveler. So yeah, really good to hear that testimony again, and reflect on the fact that he has been pretty consistent in his testimony. We know a lot more than I think the viewer would have known then about what it would have taken to become a missileer, the kind of person that
Yeah.
Bob Salas was, and knowing what we know about how someone becomes a missileer and how profiled, how selected they are, how evaluated they are, adds additional credibility to that kind of testimony. So in some ways, I kind of was disappointed in the rapid fire nature of this panel because there are so many other questions, and I'm sure you thought this too because you're such a great interviewer. There's so many other questions that you're like, oh, but I really want to know about this, and
Mm.
why is this person so credible, and what else can they tell us? And but you're just given this rapid fire pacing, and you're kind of like, okay, I guess we're just move on to the next witness here. It's a lot to take all of a sudden and in that quick soundbite.
Do you think for this setting, though, and thanks for the compliment, this works better because we talk about now social media day. Everyone wants quick information, gives it in a couple of minute video, bang. I don't want to watch long form,
Mm.
TLDR, too long, didn't read, all that kind of stuff in modern day. Even back then, when you're announcing 20 witnesses, that could have been an all day event. But to go up there and see you've got 2 or 3 minutes, let's hit them with what we've got. Let's
Mhm.
call out the main bullet points. And then obviously they say you can ask questions after, all that kind of stuff, and you can speak privately. Do you think that maybe works then in that setting? Because it really gets your attention and it's kind of death by a thousand cuts?
I think it does. I think that was the point. It's let's hit them hard, hit them fast, and then let's pique the curiosity to then have further conversations. And Greer came prepared, I think, for providing that additional information. He was ready to provide those briefing packets to press, and kind of get things moving. So yeah, I do think it was the right call. I don't think a day long conference would have really moved the needle in the same way. Um, but I don't know. I don't know. It's fascinating. You kind of when you put it in that context about quick clips today in social media. It, you and then where we are and the kind of how we approach the topic generally now. The only person that I know that does the quick clips kind of thing is like Dan Warren, who does his
Mm,
little social media thing. The rest of us are doing long form content, so it's really interesting, right, to kind of have that as a juxtaposition, given the difference in time. Um, And so maybe, kind of that quick hitter type of peppering you with all this credentialed, information is really the way to go. But, you can think about an example of that perhaps with the Age of Disclosure movie, which I haven't had a chance to see, but it does
no, yeah.
presumably work in a similar fashion. There are 30 some witnesses in that movie. They're all giving their testimony, and it's just, back to back to back to back. And you're going to have to come away going, well, do I believe this to be true or not? So there's something to be said for volume and consistency, and I think you do get that with this press club event.
Yeah, perhaps with longer form, different topic, different argument, but longer form information stays with you.
Hmm.
I could sum this up in a 3 minute TikTok and be like, oh, guys, did you know that Steven Greer done this and da da da? He was
Yep.
surrounded by 20 witnesses, rapid fire pictures flash up. Great. That's wonderful for a certain audience. How are they going to take that in and keep it though? Is it then too easy to be like, wow, that's really interesting. Next, oh
Yeah.
wow, look at that car crash. Oh wow,
Totally.
look at that.
Yeah,
So
I think you're right.
and move on.
Um, and let's kind of think about this too. That in 2001, the way that most individuals got their media was through network media. So this would have been through uh, you know NBC, ABC, CBS. If it's not getting covered on one of those networks, then it's really not getting seen by anyone. So, it's interesting where we are now, like when you're looking at those witnesses and thinking, oh, I'd like to have that person on as a guest. Like I would like to go into a deep dive and you'd actually
Yeah,
get a lot of listeners into that content. And that's not something that just didn't exist back then. The only people that could do deep dives were network journalists, right? So if they're not
yeah.
going to pick up that interview, then nobody else is going to hear about it, and people are just going to move on to the next story.
Yeah, I don't think this would have touched the UK news. It's hard enough to get a story to do that now when we are saturated with news, let alone back then. But any listeners who maybe were around back then in the UK, let me know if it did reach the shores over here. I imagine it would have been a bit of a laughy end of the news segment, And finally, so yeah, moving on, ninth witness Dwayne Arneson, US Air Force. He worked in communications. Also dished out nuclear launch codes, I believe he said was part of his job. So real credibility within that. He saw a message through one of the comm systems one day. I was a little confused exactly what his job was, but it sounded like crypto stuff, not crypto as we know it now, but deciphering messages, all that kind of thing. Um, that a UFO had crashed near Norway, I think he said, and was being retrieved. And he was also aware of missiles being turned off and deactivated by UFOs. So, yeah, backing up what's been said before.
Yeah, for sure. Just another credentialed person with access to top secret information. I mean, the thing about these guys too, though, that you could, as a skeptic, you could say, well, that's what the message said, but was that actually true? These are people that just kind of receive the comms and move the comms to somebody else that actually knows what the message means. So
Yep.
you could say this was some sort of coded message and not really a UFO, but it was some other clandestine operation, and they had who knows? But I
Yeah.
do think it's interesting to that you'd be willing to come forward and talk about that.
Um, Second most watched clip was up next. Harland, Bentley, US Army, who came forward and said they'd seen a UFO crash and then take off after bits of it had fallen off, back off into space. He also said he had heard astronauts talk about bogies or UFOs close to their craft as well in orbit. This is the second most watched clip. So again, I'm guessing this must have been linked somewhere because there were other fascinating clips as well. But yeah, again, starting to back up. The astronaut talk is always really interesting for me. And again, to hear communications where astronauts are saying, "Whoa, do you see that?" or they're being tailed or followed. I'm here for it all day.
Absolutely. No, that's truly fascinating stuff. And we heard this was one of the first, I think, of a couple of panelists that did talk about astronauts and,
Hmm.
sworn to secrecy and that kind of thing. Of course, we haven't gotten to the NASA um, person yet, but that, certainly comes into the equation. Um, yeah, what do people know? I think this is what keeps that mystery alive, right? Is that you've got these really, uh, you know, credentialed folks, you've got titillating stories, but you don't have actual, physical evidence, and that just keeps the interest level at a certain kind of temperature, but
Hmm.
it doesn't actually push that forward. And I think we can talk about that later, just kind of how these initiatives from a macro level, kind of keep the interest sort of simmering
Yep.
without dying out entirely. And then what are the things that allow that interest to peak and cause the temperature to rise? And then what are the things that then kind of dial it back down? Because you and I have been doing this for a while now. We've seen these waves happen, where it takes this, that, or the other, a little bit of information getting released into the community, and then all of a sudden, the chatter, the traffic, the public interest is just going way up, and then it's like the temperature then gets dialed right back down, and then people start, infighting, and it changes things. So it's an argument I think that one could make that this is a kind of of controlled disclosure to a certain degree. Who's doing the controlling and exactly how that's being done, and I'm not entirely sure, but looking at it from that perspective, I think you can find evidence that that seems to be taking place.
Yeah, that interesting you say about that simmering conversation. I was speaking to Brian Bender about this a couple of months ago. So, if folks haven't checked that one out, Brian Bender, really well known journalist for Politico and other outlets. And we were speaking about the lack of follow on or impact from the congressional hearings. And I think I asked him, is there a point that they're kind of pointless? What are they achieving? And he said that they're keeping the conversation and conversation ticking over. They're keeping it simmering away. It might not bring it to the boil, but like you say, it keeps it in public eye. It keeps it front and center. We might not always like a lot of the circus that goes around it with politicians. I think that's just the nature of politics. No matter which country you're in, which party you support, it's always like that. Um, but it's better to have it there than not. And I agree with that. Same where people will complain about the quality of or validity of a video leaked by any journalist. Let's use Jeremy Corbell, George Knapp, who are very well known, and they'll put something out there and everyone jumps on it. Some people love it, some people hate it. And I'm like, but would you not rather have something to talk about and pour over than not? However, to the point you then make, Nathan, is that a really, really easy control mechanism then? Where every so often one of the gatekeepers just goes, throw them something and
Mhm.
just watches. Did you see? I only watched a couple of episodes of it. The Greek gods show that was on Netflix with Jeff Goldblum.
I don't think I did.
No, it's like he's like a god. He
Okay.
he is Zeus, but the way he treats humans, and it's like I'll give them a morsel, and it's almost that element of just
Mm.
see what they do with it, keep them occupied, keep them playing, keep them fighting. And it would be so easy to do that in the
Mhm.
UFO topic and the community or any community that claims, oh, we can't be fooled. I think it would be really easy for any of us to get caught up in something.
I agree. I think the evidence is pretty overwhelming that we are easily led. And you mentioned, before we went on the air, talking about Grant Cameron, he's got a book called Managing Magic. And that's kind of the narrative that he's providing too, is that you've got these UFO messiahs who are chosen by the gatekeepers to be the emissaries, the spokespeople, the leaders for the disclosure movement. Greer, obviously, having had been one of those messiahs, quote unquote, those leaders, and kind of and pushing for disclosure, and yet it's dialed back after that. So in some ways, it's I always look at these things as like, is somebody testing the waters, right?
Mm.
Is somebody allowing enough to come out to be received and on certain platforms, and then are they observing? How is it being digested? How's it being understood by the community? What elements are staying in the conversation? What elements are not? What are things really receptive? What are people receptive to? What are they not receptive to? They're kind of taking notes, right? And then they're going to try again later on with something else and some other person that they might back. And, Cameron gives the example of where's Tom DeLonge. So it's very interesting. It's an interesting perspective on the entire disclosure movement. And unfortunately, we really won't know the answer to all of that until we reach that point at which disclosure kind of officially happens. And of course, we could debate. Some people think that it already has, but I think from a general standpoint, it has not. So when that time comes, we can always look back with hindsight and go, I see what they were doing there. They were doing the Steven Greer thing and seeing what kind of traction that got. And they let that simmer a little bit. And they brought up Tom DeLonge and Lou Elizondo and let that simmer a little bit. That's when they introduced other kinds of aspects to the story, like consciousness. No, you don't hear anything about consciousness talked about in the press club event. We talk about it
Mm.
all the time now in ufology. So I think that's an interesting contrast. So what's going on? I don't know. We can only speculate. It's really interesting, though.
It's a little bit like the UFO community is an unwitting focus group
Agreed.
for the disclosure advocates and gatekeepers in the background to go test the temperature with those guys and gals down there, see how they react to this, what they think of this, and then it lets them go back and go, do we think the public would react the same way? It's a small sample size still.
Hmm.
Um, yeah, as we know, any number of accounts will claim every year that this is the year of disclosure.
Right.
I might often say I think we'll see some progress, but I don't think I've ever claimed it's the year of disclosure yet. So, yeah. And then when it doesn't happen, it's next year's year of disclosure. I get why that stuff frustrates people. Um, John Maynard, he had a top secret clearance, worked at the DIA. He had seen multiple documents and pictures in his role of UFOs. He says that when you talk about shadowy, gatekeeper cabals running the shadow governments, he says there are definitely black ops, and he was nearly part of it and managed to get out. He seemed quite nervous when he spoke. I don't know if you picked that up.
Yeah. Yeah. He did seem a little bit nervous. He didn't speak for very long.
No.
He wasn't speaking kind of as confidently as some of the others. Yeah. Curious, that one.
Yeah, I wonder if any of them, including guys like that, beforehand maybe got last minute look. I don't know if I want to do this.
Hmm.
Perhaps I'm better stepping away, and you could probably understand why. You can only imagine the repercussions that may have happened afterwards. And speaking of which, the next I didn't actually know this until one of the listeners got in touch. Sergeant Carl Wolf, who is a U.S. Air Force, he had a really interesting comment statement. Stationed at Langley Air Force Base in mid 1965 as part of the Lunar Orbiter project, he says he was taken into a lab to repair some malfunctioning camera equipment, and he was expertise to do that. He says he was in a dark room, and the other guy in the lab basically said to him, "Do you want to see some interesting stuff?" and showed him photos of a base on the dark side of the moon, mushroom-shaped buildings, towers, all that kind of thing. Carl Wolf said he felt really uncomfortable because he was like, "Oh, we're compartmentalized here. We're not meant to, mess about with this kind of stuff. I shouldn't know it." Short time later, someone came in, knock, knock, knock. What are you doing? But yeah, I thought that was really interesting, and I didn't know that. I believe it's October. In October 20. I've got the details here. Pardon my. Yep, October 10th, 2018. Carl Wolf was killed when he was out on his bike, hit by a tractor and trailer, and he died later on that day from the injuries. So really sad, that one. Whether or not that was a total fluke accident, of course, you're always going to get guy comes out and makes statement. To be fair, it was 17 years later, but
Yeah.
yeah. So just for folks who may or not be aware of that one, but really interesting comments.
Yeah, I thought so too. And I'd seen that clip before because I think it is so fascinating.
Yep.
And it's always, that stuff is always in the back of my mind. And it's interesting now that we have more presence on the moon. We've got the Chinese rover that's on the dark side of the moon now. We've got that private aerospace company that just recently landed their craft on the moon as well. Um, yeah, but it raises a lot of questions. How private is the private company? How
Mhm.
public is China with whatever that they discover? We tend to think that we've got this very unfiltered, kind of clear view of whatever the scientific, experimental, robotic craft is capturing and sending back. And then the agencies that receive that material, whether that be a private organization or governmental, they're just kind of taking what they receive and then just showing it to the public. And I think that that's probably really far from the truth. I think that there's certainly a lot of review of that content. And it doesn't surprise me, we're going to get into the testimony very shortly of the woman that says that maybe a lot of that stuff is doctored before it reaches the public at all.
She was up next, Donna Hare.
Yeah.
So this might be a very well known clip for folks who maybe aren't aware of the full conference. But Donna Hare was a NASA employee. She basically talks about being shown photographs. Basically, one of the guys there was like, "Hey, do you want to see something interesting?" Shows her an image of what she says she believes is the Earth. Pine trees, all that kind of stuff. Can see a shadow, and there's like she says like a dot on the microfilm, and she's like, "Well, what is it you're showing me here? Just a dot?" And he's like, "No, that's it's casting a shadow. That's an object that's there." And she basically says they were photoshopping, essentially, airbrushing photographs at NASA or burning them completely of UFOs that had been captured. And she says also that she was told by someone who was quarantined with the Apollo astronauts that they had indeed saw craft on the moon when they landed, but are very much discouraged from talking about it. Donna Hare, I believe she's still out there online as well. I'm sure I've seen her social accounts and stuff like that. Really interesting conversation.
Yeah, I agree, and she's another one that I had seen, the clips of before. Yeah, very interesting. Certainly, you wanna know more, like, what kind of person told her this information? Were they being truthful? The comment that she made about, "I presume it was Earth," was really interesting. Like, I mean, that's kind of it's a weird thing to say. I don't know why you would feel compelled to say that unless you had some notion. Maybe she held some notion that it may not have been Earth,
She's seen pictures similar to that aren't necessarily this planet, but yeah.
yeah. But that is that right. So has she seen that material and was she told it was another planet, or was that her own kind of speculation that maybe we do have presence on other planets? And it was just a weird qualifier, I think, to make. It didn't need to be made. If I was just shown a picture of the Earth and it was a forest and there was an object, like you don't have to tell me that it, specifically that I think it was this planet, right? It was very interesting.
Yeah, I would lean on the fact that it's just the circumstance and environment where it
Mm.
kind of slipped in there. It, totally unnecessary, to give that a little bit of context. But yeah, I don't think fascinating conversation to go down that route. Do we have because we hear about that kind of stuff as well, don't we, from time to time? But
Yep.
yeah, I believe, yeah, Larry Warren, who U.S. Air Force based at Rendlesham. Um, I won't go into the whole Rendlesham story. I will shamelessly plug the Encounter series at folk. If you search Encounters in your podcast app, you can go and check out a series I've done with L. Scott looking at the Rendlesham Forest incident. It's got Ross Coulthart, Nick Pope, and Charles Holt, who were all involved. So please check that one out. Um, Without going into loads of detail on Rendlesham, in the 1980s, US Air Force Base, object appears to land over a couple of days, multiple times, multiple sightings, with multiple people. Larry Warren's a bit of a controversial character in this story because folks like Charles Holt, who we know very much was involved, debates how close he was to the actual event itself. Um, and yeah, it mentions the nuclear weapons that were on UK soil being housed there, but of course, it's US weapons. Yeah, and interesting comments. He speaks well. Perhaps just someone who, over the years, allowed the story to carry him away when talking about Rendlesham. Not to take away from his testimony, but any thoughts on Larry Warren as a character?
Yeah, he's not a person that you hear talked about much when you if you do that Rendlesham deep dive, right? I mean,
Mm.
he's certainly he's a character in that cast, but you hear more about Burroughs and his encounter, and
Yep.
there's a lot more content there. But Rendlesham, is just it's a really well known case, and so um, interesting that that event taking place in, I think, 1980.
Yep.
So 21 years later, here's a guy talking about it. So it's just it does show you to some degree the 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 way which secrets are held onto, for a very long time, and what are things that are happening right now that we might not know about for 20 years, but might become well-known UFO incidents, right? So it's interesting, but yeah, I think there is a little controversy there for sure.
Um, George Filer the third is a former intel officer and pilot, and I saw the name and I was like, "That's really familiar." But I get emails from I'm guessing it's George Filer directly, as I'm presuming he's still alive. Um, but I get kind of spammed with these quite a lot on Gmail, like Filer's files, and that's where I recognize it from. I've just double checked and looked it up.
Huh.
Um, but yeah, he comes out and says in winter 1962, he was instructed to chase a UFO while flying. He was around 30,000 feet, had to dive to 1,000 feet, which is below the red level they should fly at. The object was on radar, and he said he got it around a mile out. The object lit up and glowed, and it shot off into orbit. He also briefed senior officials on UFOs while serving in Vietnam, talked about a crashed UFO on a base where an alien being came out and was shot and killed as well. So George Filer covered quite a lot in a one fell swoop here.
Yeah, enough to be really interesting, but also that you don't hear about him that much since then, right? So,
Yeah.
um, I have questions, right? How legitimate is this kind of witness? And but this is the sort of strange and frustrating thing about the topic, right? You've got a lot of stories that I think we discount out of hand as being too weird, and maybe like think of Jason Sands, right?
Mm.
It's a really recent example where it's like, I don't know, this is just really hard for me to believe. But, maybe there are some really weird things like this happening, and that's why the government may not even be too worried when people come forward and talk about it, because it's like, who's gonna believe these people?
Yeah, yeah, that's pretty on the nose too, I think. Sergeant Clifford Stone was up next at US Army. Um, Very much the closest I think we got here to a David, not a David Grush, to a Jake Barber. He says he was involved in crash retrievals where bodies were recovered from some of these retrievals. Some were even alive. Genuine, real first-hand witness, Clifford Stone. What I will caveat this with is if any of these folks in the years since have been massively debunked and whatnot, I might not know about it. And maybe Nathan, it skipped past you as well. That was a hell of a bit of testimony as well. And he came across as a straight shooter.
Yeah, yeah, and I think that the key there being that, we have consistent elements that are coming back up in the conversation, right? So you've in the from the panelists, we've heard, clandestine programs, we've heard crash retrieval, we've heard reverse engineering. You're going to hear from that, I think, very shortly. These kinds of claims have persisted over the many many years, and so yeah, you kind of have to give it some credibility, because it's not just the same people every time. There's different characters telling you the same kinds of stories, so that gives it more credibility in my book.
Does that then reflect your comments before about I was saying about a focus group and trying this stuff out, then coming back to it? Would a lot of what we're seeing now, you can see a lot of similarities in what was said and what happened back then? That let's give this another go. It's a different time. We're 24 years later, almost a quarter of a century's passed. Let's get some of these messages back out.
Yeah, I think if you're a person that thinks there's a controlled plan for this, then that's what you'd expect to see. Now, you'd expect to see consistent elements of the truth, revealed over and over again until it's accepted as true. Um, and that I think, like what you said earlier, that there are certain test beds for this material, right? There are certain focus groups for this material, and how will they react to it, and what are the elements of the truth that leave the confines of that focus group and become publicly accepted. I
Yeah.
think that's really what you're looking for, because once that happens, then the landing for the truth is a lot softer, right? You've already seeded the soil really well, so that by the time you tell the full truth, well, the truth is mostly already known. It's just that you have to, finally confirm it.
Yeah. Up next, Mark McCandlish, a former US Air Force, says in 1967 he saw a UFO over a nuclear weapons facility where his father was stationed. At this point, they talked about a colleague that Mark McCandlish had known, who says he had seen 3 UFOs working, hovering off the ground. At this point, Greer held up a diagram of like a UFO, folks, but as if it's like sliced open so you can see inside and how it works, like a blueprint. Um, I wasn't massively keen on that. I don't know about you, Nathan. I think it takes, as much as we're hearing a lot of testimony and we want more proof and evidence, I don't know how the blueprint thing sits with me. But it's a representation. The colleague told him that they were alien reproduction vehicles, or ARVs. That is a favourite of Steven Greer's over the years. And he says he showed some pictures as well of a similar looking vehicle taken by a pilot allegedly at 12,000 feet. So interesting comments. Don't know how the diagram sits with me though.
Yeah, I mean, McCandlish is this is the known as the Fluxliner vehicle, and so yeah, he is been a controversial figure, but he made some interesting comments there. Particularly the one where the individual basically said, because he said he had the colleague, had the friend, the drawing up in the office, and the guy said, how do you have this? And you shouldn't have this, blueprint, and that kind of gave it a sense of maybe it was fairly legitimate, but yeah, Greer, of course, very frequently likes to talk about alien reproduction vehicles and um, the prominence of those vehicles and how we have that technology. And it's always been part of the lore and the speculation. Do we actually have these ARVs, or is that like, because you have conflicting stories. You've got Eric Davis, who recently said that we don't. That he thinks that that's all McCandlish basically. That it
Yeah.
all concocted. And then you've got others that have done a lot of, deep dives into this topic and have said that they really think that we do. So, um, the truth, I'm sure, is somewhere in between. It's interesting.
Or it's out there, as some
Yeah,
would say.
indeed.
Um, the Again, I think it just goes to what we said earlier, where we've all got different levels of what we'll believe, what narratives we like to explore, and what we take on board in this topic. So some folks might listen to every one of these, because of the two left, one of them I'm particularly about. Um, Other folks might totally take on board all of this stuff at face value as I try to. Other folks might pick and choose. This one sounds more legit than others. I think if you watch it and you see the people speaking as well, you also try and get a read. Next up was a very young Daniel Sheehan, Danny Sheehan, lawyer, multiple time guest on this podcast. Most folks listening will know Danny and his background. Incredibly solid legal CV and history. He says the then CIA director George H.W. Herbert Walker Bush
Yes.
declined access to UFO files he was asked to look at from members of the Carter administration. He did get access to the National Archive, saw photos of a UFO with symbols. He has talked about this on multiple interviews, long form, including my own. If you haven't heard those, go back and check it out. But nice to see a very young Danny Sheehan here, and the hair hasn't changed.
Beautiful hair. Yes, it looks great. Yeah, Danny Sheehan, a lot of energy, a lot of enthusiasm. Like you said, a very credentialed legal career. And, what I found interesting about that is, one, he's still really committed to the topic all these years later. Obviously, he's not as closely affiliated with Steven Greer anymore, but he really was very closely affiliated with Greer at that time, was kind of chief counsel for the Disclosure Project. Um, and he makes some similar claims that Greer does. We can kind of get into some of that too in a little bit. Um, but what really caught my attention that I don't think I had heard before or just kind of glossed over was the whole, and I knew he had, gotten a degree in kind of Judeo-Christian studies and the Jesuit, path. And he had a very close connection to the Vatican. He'd asked the Vatican if they could take a look at their archives to see what they could find out about, what the Vatican might know, and the Vatican refused them access. So I found that to be really interesting. That it speaks to the global nature of the secrecy,
Mm.
um, and the like the cooperation, right? That would be required, not just with governments, but with religious organizations, and kind of keep a lid on the truth. So really interesting there, and kind of where that's coming up now with Diana Pasulka and her trip to the Vatican Library, and all these kinds of conversations about how much evidence do we have and how far back does it go.
Yeah. Um, Interesting choice for final speaker, although Steven Greer finishes off the conference. But in terms of the witnesses coming forward, Dr. Carol Rosen, her testimony is largely based on having spoken to Werner von Braun back when she was a student, who told her that we had to stop weaponization of space and technology, and the technology we could have. It wasn't the strongest one, this Nathan, to end on for me, because it was just, she was saying, I spoke to this person, and maybe I missed something here in terms of her background and everything. It says doctor. I don't know a lot of her background and why this was particularly relevant, other than nice anecdotal.
Right.
Um, is that unfair?
Well, I mean, I think Carol Rosen had a very close relationship with Stephen Greer, was really supportive of his movement. Maybe he allowed her to have kind of the last say. Werner von Braun being one of the key influencers in the U.S. Rocket program, space program, it does have a lot of weight to it. But I mean, you do certainly have to ask yourself, how truthful these claims are. I mean, it does boil back down to that. Well, she said that he said, that this is true. Well, I mean,
Yes.
he's dead. How are we to know that this is actually true? This could all be a fabrication. So it's interesting. But she likes to tell that story that he explained to her that this kind of that the threats would be this, and the threat would be that, and then the threat would be space, and then the threat, I think that is an interesting story to consider if we're going to entertain this hypothesis. There's some sort of shadow government kind of steering humanity in a certain direction. But I think the danger of that is it does kind of take you right into conspiracy town, like, right away. The
Mhm.
other witnesses are very much like kind of matter of fact. Now, these are my credentials, and this is what I did, and this is what I saw. And, I have personal experience with this, and this is kind of, well, what does that really mean? And the implications are really hard for me to come to terms with. And then it raises all these other rabbit holes you start chasing as a result of it. So I'm not sure it's necessarily the best one to land on. Um, so yeah, I have mixed feelings about her too.
Greer finishes off. He announces they're kind of running 15, 20 minutes late and behind, and you can kind of see them during the event as well. I think a few folks are like, "Yeah, keep it going, keep it going, keep it going." Um, he mentions 400 witnesses are ready to come forward. It's a plea to those watching and listening. Congress, if you're listening to this, we want to speak to you. We want to get these witnesses in front of you. Please take this seriously. Um, but we know they don't, and that doesn't happen. Um, Before we get to media reaction and stuff, what's your take, Nathan, and any other notes you've got on the event itself?
Yeah, it's I mean, we can look at it from a lot of different perspectives. Like you talked about earlier, this is sort of the year of 9/11. So
Mm.
we've had some momentum here, and then all of a sudden that event really changed in a dramatic way the course of the early 21st century. Um, who knows how close we were to really getting serious attention on this? And we've heard that over and over, that we've been really close to getting serious attention to this issue, and yet we can't quite cross the finish line. Um, so it is interesting, and I think it for someone that understands this history, you could be very frustrated with where we are now, and I think you probably see that a lot, and I'm sure you see it in comments that you get from some of the interviews you've done. You got the jaded ufologist in your comment, so he's like, "I've seen that. I've been doing this for 50 years, and I've seen it, and I'm tired of it. It's all lies." So that I think is understandable when you've witnessed this kind of thing, and you've never really seen it come to fruition. Are we in a different time now? I feel that we might be. at least to the degree to which our elected officials seem to be taking it seriously, and the public at large is taking it more seriously. He's willing to talk about it. Um, and and then what does that do to Stephen Greer, right? I think that's the other component of this whole thing that it makes me wonder about his own journey, and where he pivoted from this direction to another one, and you could probably put yourself in his shoes and feel pretty disappointed that all this hard work didn't actually result in him being the champion of disclosure in 2001, like he probably thought was going to happen, right? So what does that do to him personally, and where is he now with the subject? He could be pretty bitter perhaps about where he is, and bitter towards people like Lou Elizondo, who are getting all the attention now, and feeling like, well, I did all this work, long before he did, and he's getting all the attention, and I should be the one who get it because I did, I worked so hard to push this forward before. So a lot of interesting things to consider here, and I think you kind of have to, eh, just a big picture standpoint. You've got to weigh this. I think as everybody has to weigh this on their own. Um, we're in a little bit of a lull period now, and how close do we think we really are? Like you said, I don't want to be the person to say it's this year to give those kinds of prognostications. Um, but it's important to know your history. It's important to kind of go into this with wide eyes and be willing to accept that there could be aspects of this that are not what you think, that are not true, and be disclosure as you think maybe it needs to be may never actually happen. That's something that I think all of us have to wrestle with, and it can be tough if you're in the business of really talking about this and interested in it.
I think just to point out the 9/11 thing is often mentioned around why this event didn't have a longer lasting legacy or impact. I don't believe it's because 9/11 happened because of this event or because of UFO secrecy. But I think, understandably, when 9/11 happened, in those seconds of those planes hitting the towers, the one going down the Pentagon, the one hit the Pentagon, then one went down in the field, didn't it? And
In
so,
Pennsylvania, yeah.
yeah, things changed for the world at that point, and it took a lot of people's attention away. So you think even folks who maybe were just, like I say, maybe got the video of the conference a month after it happened, got like a really bad downloaded file from LimeWire or Kazaa, they were even about back then, and managed to watch this. If they're starting to look into the topic, within the first few weeks or months, the world changes, and that just goes out the window for a lot of folks. So I think that for me is more of what kind of happened there. The media reaction immediately afterwards. So a couple of headlines from the following day. ABC News: group calls for UFO for disclosure of UFO info. Um, there was Washington Post: UFO believers cited here, a little bit more dismissive of a headline. And private UPI archives. Private project pushes for UFO hearings. The media, there was a kind of mixed reaction to it. No one really picked up the story and ran with it. There was no prolonged coverage. It landed between interesting to absolute nonsense, but there was an undertone of even the people who were poo-pooing this. When I was reading through some of the articles, they were interested that the credibility of the witnesses and credentials of the witnesses was of a reasonably good standard. That seemed to get folks' attention, even who weren't interested at all in trying to treat this seriously. They then struggled with the fact there was a lot of great stories, not a lot of great evidence, not taking testimony as evidence, which I can understand, and I think you've kind of mentioned that, and we've mentioned that reflecting throughout. Um, how does this for you echo today? We've kind of touched on this, but if you've got what Greer tried to do then, he's still involved now, so that longevity is there. Greer's into his like third decade, almost fourth at one point soon, involved in the UFO topic. His message may have changed, and that's, I think, a podcast for perhaps another time, a deeper look into Steven Greer and that evolution. But some of the message is still the same. How he comes across, I think, for me, is always my big barrier with him. Especially, like I say, that statement from way back at the beginning, where what was it he said? Please be skeptical, but that's not the same as being closed-minded and prejudiced. I feel that's him these days. and that's his demeanor and outlook and take on this stuff. I will say, unless you're Khloe Kardashian, where I felt he was fawning over that because I think he knows the audience and reach there on that particular show, so he wouldn't dare be rude. And we'll talk about another interview where he is perhaps a bit rude in listener questions. But yeah, how does that echo today, foreshadow today, and do you see anything similar perhaps happening now, and would it have an impact?
Yeah, I mean, one thing that I think stands out really clearly is how consistent Stephen Greer has been in his core message, right? That there is secrecy. The government, there's a shadowy element of the government that's kept this secret. That we've we've got access to this technology. We've reverse engineered the technology. That the government and special interests are keeping this from the world. And the other point that he likes to drive home is that extraterrestrials, so he comes at it, purely from the extraterrestrial hypothesis that extraterrestrials are basically good and they're here to welcome humanity into a greater galactic civilizations. This is kind of he talks about this at the end of the press club event. That this is kind of the maturing of humanity to kind of coalesce as one species, be united, and then mature into the greater cosmic community, right? So he's got this very love and light, secret government bad, amazing technology is hidden from everyone, like that. Those core themes have been consistent throughout, I think, his entire message. And for those of us who spend a lot of time talking about this and exploring the different nuances of what this might be, in talking to experiencers and other folks that have had, uh, you know, uh, first or secondhand accounts, you quickly realize that, at least I have, that this is way more complicated than that nice, neat narrative that Stephen Greer has proposed. And I think that's where you get quite frustrated with him. It's like, well, it can't be just like you're saying because you have to consider all of these other aspects to this. And it doesn't seem like he's willing to, I think, parrot what you're saying here. He's not willing to entertain these other hypotheses, right? He's
No.
he's prejudiced in his own right on, again, for his version of the truth here. And someone who takes that perspective, at least from my, you know, experience, is very off-putting. It's like, if you're not willing to entertain other notions, you're just kind of thinking it's always this, like that. You're turning me off right there. I'm just not going to follow you because it's I need someone who can say it could also be this, or this is certainly part of it, and it's more complicated than I think. You don't hear that at all from Greer, and you never really have.
No, I would find it off-putting if, for example, if I interviewed a guest and 10 other podcasters did, and one of those podcasters or any multiple of them all said, "You only need to listen to my interview. My interview is the best one. Don't bother with the rest. They're just absolute nonsense. Anything you need to know and more is included in mine." That really puts me off. Even if the interview turns out to be really good, I don't think I've ever and wouldn't ever declare anything I've done to be the best or the definitive. Go and listen to different opinions, different takes. Greer consistently fails to do that. If
Mhm.
it's not something he likes or doesn't fit his narrative or agenda, he totally dismisses it out of hand. And I don't think you can do that. The biggest one for me, and let's be fair, there may be many elements of the topic Greer is spot on with. And I've always said I think his message back then was far clearer and easier to get on board with or palatable than it is now. My issue is that all ET are friendly. All of these species have our best interests at heart. We are the bad ones, and there are no bad aliens. There are no bad entities. And I'm like, you can't say that because you're calling half of the experiencers and half of the folks involved in this liars. And it's stuff that you can't prove anyway. You can't prove that. That's a frustration for me with Greer. But ultimately, for me, Nathan, to sum up the event, I think it's one that people should go back and watch. I think I hope we've conveyed through this conversation, there are elements of it that you look and go, wow, that just sounds like the Tic Tac event, you know, and that's them talking about an event from decades before in 2001, about an event that was going to become famous years later that happened in 2004 with the Tic Tac. There's a lot of great stuff in there, and I think there's a lot of food for thought as well.
Yeah, I completely agree. Well worth the time. I've enjoyed kind of getting into this reflection on it, though. And one thing that really stuck out for me is that you have a lot of the witnesses who they have these great credentials, and they also talk about other credentialed people who've confirmed that this is true. But those people aren't at the podium, right? They're not even in the room. But you hear about this from several of them that, so and so from this organization told me, or this other person from this other agency was there, confirmed that this was true. You have these little elements where other folks within the government who are closer to the secrets are confirming that this is a reality. And what I find interesting about that is fast forward 2 decades, and what do we have? We actually have more people from within the government who are confirming that this is a reality. So, that tells me what they're telling the folks at the time, that is true, right? There are these folks in the government who are confirming this is real. And we've heard from some of them in the last few years, and I think we're gonna continue to hear from more of them as time goes on. If I were to take the most optimistic view of this subject, we are on a slow, very managed trajectory to where this ultimately will be widely accepted by the world. And it takes a lot of time, a lot of efforts, a lot of different, kind of mediums of conveying the message in a lot of platforms to really kind of properly see this as an acceptable idea. And that's what you would do. That's what I would do if I had a difficult truth to tell the world. I would probably try to do it as gradually as possible and minimize the impact as much as I possibly could. But is it a perfect campaign? And does it go exactly according to somebody's master plan? No. And are all the truths good things? No. This is where I certainly disagree with Steven Greer. I think there are some very uncomfortable truths to be told here about the
Mm.
subject, and perhaps one day we will know what those are.
Absolutely. And what we'll do is dive into some listener questions and thoughts to finish off, Nathan. But like I mentioned at the start of the podcast, folks, I'm offering a month free on the Patreon platform. You can get a 2-week free trial on Apple Podcasts as well. I'm going to stick this onto the paid versions, but like I say, you can get that free this month. So there's no excuse not to give that a go if you want to hear a little bit more. Nathan will stay with me, I hope, for another 10, 15, 20 minutes just to go over your listener questions. So if you're on the free feeds, thank you so much for listening. Really hope you've enjoyed this deep dive. Send over any suggestions of what you maybe want to see covered in future deep dives. If you want to hear a little bit more, and myself and Nathan going over listener questions, you'll hear it on the paid feeds or sign up to one of the free trials. The links are in the description. Click on those and get a little bit more bang for your buck. So thank you if you're leaving us here. Goodbye, and thank you, Nathan.
Good to be here.
Oh, how can people follow you, Nathan, if they are leaving us here?
Yeah, so you can find me on Twitter under a waif soul, and then of course I've got two podcasts, Liminal Frames and Calling All Beings, and I'm about once a month on Calling All Beings, and about once every 3 weeks on Liminal Frames. You can find those on all your podcasting platforms.
Please go and check those out. Would appreciate it, folks. I'll put the link in the description as well for the socials for Nathan. And Nathan, in the meantime, let's carry on with some listener questions.
Sounds great.